telling Leanne and me that only the good die young. With Mama at work for the day, we had the house to ourselves. Had she been there, Mama would have said, "Will y'all please cut that racket off? I don't see how you can stand it." Then in our late teens, we had little concern for our eardrums. Although the season had come and gone, we were just getting around to spring cleaning in the heat of late July. Left alone and to our own devices for the day, we were faced with being able to prove, upon our mother's return later in the day, that we had made some progress in our mother's absence with the annual heavy-duty cleaning. Adapting Snow White's whistle-while-you-work routine to our own taste, the chores were made bearable by the vibrating bass thud of the stereo. Venetian blinds were down, storm windows were out, and normal furniture placement was askew. Above the music and the male singer's voice, I thought I heard the approach of a vehicle. Thinking perhaps it was Daddy coming in, although it was only mid-morning, I went to our front kitchen window. My mother had this window enlarged when we were children so she could see out her kitchen, I suppose, feeling trapped there on days when the housework and two small children overwhelmed her. Enlarging the window had proved to be a wise choice of renovation as it became our window to the world. It was a vantage point from which we could see all the comings and goings of neighbors as they traveled the road which runs past my parents' house. The window was our lookout post. Looking out the window and now hearing what had become the roar of an engine, I saw nothing. A second later, one of the community's fire trucks, its red lights flashing, rolled up around the second sharp blind curve in our driveway. "I wonder what Mr. Brubeck's doing bringing the fire truck up in here," I yelled with no alarm to Leanne, who had not left her cleaning in the back of the house. She was so unconcerned with my offering of information that even knowing a fire truck was now stopped at our back door did not pull her away from the window she was washing. I went out on our enclosed back porch and stood inside the screen door, which we always kept hooked on the inside when at the house alone. Keeping the doors locked and not allowing anyone, even people closely known to us in the house when our parents weren't there, was a safety precaution Mama had ingrained in us. I stood there on the safe side of the screen door with damp cleaning rag in hand as Mr. Brubeck, the fire truck's driver, leapt out of the emergency vehicle and rushed to our back door. Bill Brubeck is Middlebrook's postmaster, hardware store owner, proprietor, and in that year, chief of the volunteer fire company. If the village had a mayoral election, I suppose he would have been a strong contender for that position too. Also, usually being the closest volunteer fireman to the firehouse when the alarm sounded, he drove one of the fire trucks when responding to a call. "Eddie, where's the fire?" Mr. Brubeck said excitedly. He was standing on the other side of the screen door now, tugging at the knob, trying to get the door open. "Fire," I said. "What fire?" "Fire! Where's the fire?" he said more anxiously now. I shook my head and said, "There's no fire here. We didn't even have so much as a stove burner heating." At that moment, Leanne stepped out onto the back porch. Seeing her, and I suppose considering her as the older of the two of us to be more lucid than me in an emergency situation, Mr. Brubeck looked past me and said, "Leanne, where's the fire?" Perhaps Fire Chief thought he knew my sister better than I did. Perhaps he thought that, having discovered a raging inferno somewhere in our house, she had calmly called the fire department and alerted them to the need for help without telling her younger sister. I did not think this to be the case. The fire, Mr. Brubeck kept saying. He was really becoming insistent, and I looked down over the hill to see not only the company's the other two fire trucks, but its full complement of volunteer firemen pulling up in their vehicles onto our front yard in a helter-skelter fashion. By this time it had become a little too much for me to endure, so I reluctantly unhooked the screen door and stepped out onto the back stoop. I looked up under the eaves and out along the side of our house for signs of smoke rolling out. Maybe I thought the house really was on fire. We had not noticed it and someone else had reported it. Seeing no smoke, I shook my head and said with a puzzled expression and half smile on my face, There isn't a fire. We don't have a fire." But my word was not proof enough for the fire chief. There was a fire somewhere, and by golly, he was going to see to it that the blaze was doused. "We got a call," he said breathlessly. "Joe Hamilton's place." He was repeating the dispatcher's message, which did indeed seem to be directions to our house. "We didn't call in any fire," my sister offered, having finally come to life. The arriving volunteers now had made their way to our back door and stood expectantly around the truck in which Mr. Brubeck had arrived. The situation was beginning to get a little embarrassing. Leanne and I were on the spot. Surely they didn't suspect us of having called in a false alarm just to see the fire trucks roll. Mr. Brubeck, tall, lanky, and a few years younger than my parents, strode begrudgingly to his truck and radioed the dispatcher, who confirmed the directions to the supposed fire. Having heard the dispatcher's remarks, I offered, maybe it's one of the tenant houses, knowing there were two other possibilities if this was the case. The dispatcher's voice came back over the radio specifically confirming Joe Hamilton's place on Road 712, the first house on the right and left. Hearing those comments, I knew the firemen had reached the proper destination to which they had been dispatched. Mr. Brubeck continued to talk with the dispatcher, trying to obtain information which might clear up the mystery. All I could do was smile and shrug in ignorance at the firemen standing in our yard. I couldn't help but feel a little sorry for them. With no prospect of a fire to extinguish, they looked forlornly at the big engine, which was kept clean and shining. One of the men fiddled with a highly polished stainless steel hose hookup on the truck. The valve had been buffed so much it mirrored the reflections of the men standing around it. Other men looked longingly at the axes, hoses, ladders, and extinguishers fastened to various places on the truck. A few of the men had on their fire suits. They looked unhappy and disappointed. I wanted to say, gee guys, sorry our house isn't burned down, but did not. However, as the hostess responsible for entertaining these uninvited but not unwelcome guests, it was reassuring to know so many men would drop whatever they were doing and come to our house to help put out a fire. But as a hostess, I felt I was not fulfilling my duty. A hostess is responsible for seeing to it that her guests enjoy themselves. And by the looks on the volunteer firemen's faces, it was obvious they were not having a good time. Wearing old shorts and a t-shirt, I thought perhaps if I stood in the yard, struck a match, and let the firemen hose me down, their spirits would be lifted. Gilmer, I heard the dispatcher's voice say, revealing the name of the person who had placed the fire call, and I immediately knew what had happened. Our neighbor, who lived behind and down the hill from us, had placed the call and given our house as a landmark. Lily Gilmer was, at that time, I guess, in her late 70s. She and her adult son lived in the next house closest to ours. Although the years were approaching the 1980s, the Gilmers had just recently installed a telephone and running water in the old farmhouse in which they lived. Lily still cooked on a wood stove, which, as it turned out, was the cause of the fire call. Having only had her telephone a short time, being unfamiliar with the use of the device and a little hard of hearing herself, Lily had not realized that the dispatcher had not correctly repeated the directions our neighbor had given. This resulted in the firemen arriving at our house instead of hers. Lily Gilmer, I said to the fireman, the fire's at Gilmer's. Mystery saw the firemen ran toward the